The flare's distant glow flickered on the horizon, a beacon of hope in the darkness that consumed the city. My heart raced at the sight, pounding against my ribcage like a caged animal desperate to break free. The thought of other survivors out there, fighting to stay alive just like me, sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins. But the throbbing pain in my ankle quickly tempered my excitement. The injury had been a constant companion since my last encounter with the undead, a painful reminder of how close I'd come to joining their ranks. Each step sent a fresh jolt of agony up my leg, but I gritted my teeth and pushed forward. I had to investigate, had to find out if there was still a shred of humanity left in this godforsaken city. I made my way through the deserted streets, the eerie silence broken only by the occasional moan of a distant zombie or the skittering of rats in the shadows. The once vibrant city had become a tomb, its buildings crumbling and its streets choked with the wreckage of a society that had torn itself apart. As I limped through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself whirling around at every imagined sound, my heart racing and my finger tightening on the trigger of my gun. But there was never anything there. Just the empty streets and the endless shadows. I forced myself to keep moving, to focus on the task at hand. I had to be smart about this, had to conserve my energy and my resources. As I turned a corner, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There, on the wall of an abandoned building, was a message scrawled in red paint. Survivors, we have shelter. Follow the signs. Beside the message was an arrow, pointing down a narrow alleyway. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the message, hardly daring to believe it was real. But there it was. A tangible sign of life in a world that had all but given up on it. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with the possibilities. What if it was a trap? What if the survivors were hostile, or worse, infected? I'd heard stories of groups that had gone mad in the face of the apocalypse, turning on each other in a desperate bid for survival. But I couldn't ignore the flare, couldn't ignore the chance that there might still be some good left in the world. And so, with a deep breath and a muttered prayer, I set off down the alleyway, following the signs that promised salvation. The alley was dark and narrow, the walls pressing in on me like the jaws of some great beast. I could feel the eyes of the undead on me, could hear their moans growing louder with every step. My ankle screamed with every movement, but I forced myself to keep going, my eyes fixed on the signs that guided me forward. And then, just as I thought I could go no further, I saw it. A door, hidden in the shadows of the alley, with a symbol painted on its surface, the same symbol that had been on the signs, a promise of shelter and safety. With trembling hands, I reached out and turned the handle, my heart in my throat. The door swung open, revealing a dimly lit stairwell that descended into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, my mind reeling with the possibilities of what lay ahead. But I knew I had no choice. I had to see this through. Had to find out if there was still a glimmer of hope in this world of darkness. And so, with a deep breath and a final glance over my shoulder, I stepped through the door and into the unknown. As I descended the dimly lit stairwell, the air grew colder and damper as I made my way deeper underground, the sound of my labored breathing echoing off the narrow walls. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a long, dark tunnel, the only light coming from a flickering fluorescent bulb that cast eerie shadows on the damp concrete. I began to limp my way down the tunnel, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness ahead. Just as I thought I could go no further, I saw a light up ahead, a faint glimmer of hope in the darkness. I quickened my pace, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle as I stumbled towards the light. As I drew closer, I realized that the light was coming from a massive steel door set into the wall of the tunnel. The door was covered in intricate carvings and symbols, a testament to the skill and artistry of whoever had created it. I reached out and traced my fingers over the carvings, marveling at their beauty and complexity. And then, With a deep breath and a final glance over my shoulder, I pushed against the door with all my strength. To my surprise, the door swung open easily, revealing a cavernous chamber filled with warm light and the sound of voices. I stepped inside, my eyes widening in disbelief as I took in the scene before me. The chamber was filled with people, dozens of them, all going about their daily lives as if the world outside had never ended. There were men and women, children and the elderly, all working together to create a sense of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. I stood there for a moment, my mouth hanging open in shock, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. And then, a voice cut through the din, snapping me out of my reverie. "Welcome to the sanctuary," the voice said, and I turned to see a man approaching me, his hand outstretched in greeting. "My name is Marcus, and I'm the leader of this community. And you are?" "Hunter," I managed to stammer out, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I saw your signs. I can't believe this place is real." Marcus smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Believe it, Hunter. We've worked hard to create a safe haven here, a place where people can live and thrive even in the midst of the apocalypse." He gestured for me to follow him, and I limped along behind him. As we made our way through the sanctuary, Marcus pointed out the different areas: the living quarters, the communal kitchen, the infirmary. "We have everything we need here to survive," he explained, his voice filled with pride. "We grow our own food, generate our own power, and take care of our own. It's not an easy life, but it's a life worth living." As we walked, I couldn't help but notice the way the other survivors looked at me, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I could understand their wariness. After all, I was an outsider, a stranger in their midst. But as Marcus led me into the infirmary and introduced me to Sarah, the community's doctor, I felt a glimmer of hope stirring in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I had finally found a place where I could belong, where I could start to rebuild my shattered life. And yet, even as I lay on the examination table, my ankle throbbing as Sarah tended to my injury, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. But for now, I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the warmth and comfort of the sanctuary, on the promise of a new beginning in a world gone mad. I had survived the horrors of the outside world, had clawed my way back from the brink of death. And now, as I drifted off to sleep in the soft glow of the infirmary's light, I knew that I would do whatever it took to protect this place, to keep the darkness at bay for as long as I could. Weeks had passed since I first stumbled into the sanctuary, my body battered and my ankle shattered from the trials of the outside world. I had spent countless days lying in the infirmary, drifting in and out of consciousness as my body fought to heal itself. But even in my darkest moments, I had never been alone. Sarah, the community's doctor, had been a constant presence at my bedside, her gentle hands and soothing voice guiding me back from the brink of despair. I slowly began to regain my strength, my body mending itself little by little. And with each passing day, I found myself growing more and more curious about the sanctuary and the people who called it home. I spent long hours talking with Sarah, learning about the history of the community and the challenges they had faced in the early days of the outbreak. She told me about the sacrifices they had made, the loved ones they had lost, and the unbreakable bonds they had forged in the face of unimaginable adversity. And as I listened to her stories, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and admiration for these people, for the strength and resilience they had shown in the face of such overwhelming odds. But even as I began to integrate myself into the community, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There were whispers and sideways glances, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was only natural for people to be wary of an outsider. But as the days wore on, I began to sense a deeper unease, a tension that hung heavy in the air like a gathering storm. And then, one day, as I was helping to tend to the community's crops, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Two of the survivors were talking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the rustling of the plants. "We can't trust him," one of them said, his voice tinged with fear. "We don't know anything about him, about what he's capable of." "But he's injured," the other replied, her voice hesitant. "And Sarah seems to trust him." "Sarah's too trusting," the first voice snapped. "She'd let a fox into the henhouse if it looked harmless enough." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to their words, my mind reeling with the implications. Did they really see me as a threat, even after all I had been through? And if so, what did that mean for my future in the sanctuary? I tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the work at hand. But even as I plunged my hands into the rich, dark soil, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. And then, just as I was about to give voice to my concerns, I heard a shout from across the compound. I looked up to see Marcus, the leader of the community, striding towards me with a grim expression on his face. "Hunter," he said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to talk." I felt my heart sink as I followed him into the command center, the room where the community's leaders made their decisions. Marcus gestured for me to sit, his eyes never leaving my face. "I'll cut right to the chase," he said, his voice grave. "Some of the others have expressed concerns about your presence here. They're worried that you might be a problem for us here at the sanctuary." I felt my stomach clench at his words, a wave of anger and despair washing over me. After everything I had been through, after all the pain and suffering I had endured, how could they possibly think that I would betray them? But even as I opened my mouth to protest, I saw the look in Marcus's eyes, the weight of responsibility that hung heavy on his shoulders. And in that moment, I understood. He was just trying to protect his people, to keep them safe in a world where safety was a luxury that few could afford. And if that meant questioning my motives, my loyalty, then so be it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I understand," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. "And I want you to know that I would never do anything to harm this community. You've given me a second chance, a reason to keep fighting, and I won't let you down." Marcus studied me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face for any sign of deceit. Slowly, he nodded. "I believe you," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But I need you to understand that trust is a fragile thing in this world. It takes time to build, and even longer to repair once it's been broken." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I understand," I said again, my voice barely more than a whisper. And as I walked out of the command center, my heart heavy with the weight of the challenges that lay ahead, I knew that I would have to work harder than ever to prove myself to the sanctuary, to earn the trust and respect of the people who had taken me in. I found myself settling into a new routine at the sanctuary. My ankle had healed, thanks to Sarah's diligent care and my own determination to recover, and I was finally able to contribute to the community in a meaningful way. Marcus had assigned me to work on fortifying the sanctuary's defenses, a task that I threw myself into with a sense of purpose and dedication. I spent long hours working alongside the other survivors, reinforcing the walls and barriers that kept the undead at bay. It was hard work, but it was also deeply satisfying. With every nail I hammered, every board I sawed, I felt a sense of accomplishment and pride, knowing that I was helping to make the sanctuary a safer and more secure place for everyone who called it home. As I worked, I got to know the other survivors better, learning their stories and their struggles. There was Jack, a former construction worker who had lost his entire family to the outbreak, and Sarah, the doctor who had become like a sister to me during my recovery. And then there was Lila, a quiet and reserved woman who rarely spoke about her past. But as we worked side by side, day after day, I began to see glimpses of the person she had been before the world had ended. She had a quick wit and a dry sense of humor, and she could always be counted on to lighten the mood with a well-timed joke or a sarcastic comment. And when she smiled, it was like the sun breaking through the clouds on a stormy day. I found myself drawn to her, to the strength and resilience that she embodied. And as the days wore on, I began to feel a sense of connection with her, a bond that went beyond the simple camaraderie of survivors working towards a common goal. But even as I grew closer to Lila and the other survivors, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been growing in the back of my mind. There were still whispers and sideways glances, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. One evening, as I was walking back to my quarters after a long day of work, I overheard a conversation. "We can't keep him here," a voice said, low and urgent. "He's a liability, a risk we can't afford to take." "But he's proven himself," another voice argued. "He's worked harder than anyone to keep this place safe." "That doesn't matter," the first voice snapped. "We don't know anything about him, about what he's capable of. For all we know, he could be working for the other side." I felt my heart sink as I listened to their words, a sense of betrayal and hurt washing over me. After everything I had done, after all the sacrifices I had made, how could they still doubt me? I wanted to confront them, to demand an explanation for their mistrust and suspicion. But something held me back. A sense of caution and self-preservation that had been honed by months of surviving in a world gone mad. Instead, I slipped away quietly, my mind racing with questions and doubts. I knew that I would have to tread carefully in the days and weeks ahead, to watch my back and keep my guard up. Something was coming. I could feel it in my bones. And whatever it was, I knew that it would test the bonds of trust and loyalty that held the sanctuary together. But for now, all I could do was wait and watch, to keep my eyes and ears open for any sign of trouble on the horizon. Because in a world where the dead walked and the living were few and far between, trust was a commodity that was all too easily broken. And once it was gone, there was no telling what horrors might be unleashed in its wake. I was jolted awake by the sound of gunfire and explosions, the harsh reality of our world crashing down upon us once again. Instantly alert, I grabbed my weapons and raced outside to join the fray. The scene that greeted me was one of utter chaos. Raiders, heavily armed and ruthless, had breached the sanctuary's defenses and were now rampaging through the compound. They fired indiscriminately, their bullets tearing through flesh and bone with sickening precision. I dove for cover behind a low wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Around me, the other survivors were scrambling to mount a defense, their faces etched with fear and determination. I caught a glimpse of Marcus. He growled with a fierce determination. "We can't let them take the sanctuary!" I gripped my rifle tightly, my finger hovering over the trigger. I had never been a soldier, had never taken a life before the outbreak. But in this moment, I knew that I would do whatever it took to protect the people I had come to call my family. I popped up from behind the wall, my aim steady as I fired at the nearest raider. The bullet caught him in the chest and he crumpled to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. But there were more coming, their faces twisted with rage and bloodlust. They surged forward, brandishing guns and knives and clubs, their eyes glinting with a feral hunger. I heard a scream to my left and turned to see Lila, her face contorted in pain as a raider's blade sliced through her arm. Without hesitation, I charged forward, my rifle forgotten as I tackled the man to the ground. We grappled in the dirt, our bodies intertwined in a deadly embrace. I could feel the raider's hot breath on my face, could see the madness in his eyes as he tried to plunge his knife into my chest, but I was faster, stronger. With a roar of fury, I wrenched the knife from his grasp and buried it in his throat, feeling the warm spray of blood on my face as he gurgled his last breath. I staggered to my feet, my chest heaving with exertion. Around me, the battle raged on, the survivors fighting tooth and nail against the raiders. I saw Jack, his face a mask of grim determination as he swung a baseball bat, cracking skulls and breaking bones with every blow. Sarah was there too, her medical training forgotten as she fired a pistol with shaking hands. I saw the tears streaming down her face as she pulled the trigger again and again, her eyes haunted by the weight of the lives she had taken. And then, just when it seemed like we might be gaining the upper hand, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the unmistakable moan of the undead, the guttural hunger of a zombie horde drawn by the noise and chaos of the battle. I turned to see them shambling towards us, their eyes glazed and their mouths twisted in a rictus grin. They were coming from all sides, a tide of rotting flesh and snapping jaws that threatened to overwhelm us all. "Fall back!" Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the moans of the undead. "We can't fight them all." But it was too late. The zombies were upon us, their hands grasping and their teeth tearing. I saw one of the raiders, his face contorted in terror as a zombie sank its teeth into his throat, ripping out a chunk of flesh with a sickening tear. I fought my way through the horde, my knife flashing in the sunlight as I hacked and slashed at the undead. Beside me, Lila stood tall, her injured arm forgotten as she swung a machete with deadly precision. Together, we fought our way back to the heart of the sanctuary, the survivors rallying around us in a desperate last stand. We formed a circle, our backs to each other as we faced the horde, our weapons at the ready. With a roar, we charged forward, our blades and bullets tearing through the undead with a savage fury. We fought with everything we had, our bodies and souls pushed to the brink of exhaustion. But somehow, against all odds, we had emerged victorious. The sanctuary was safe, for now at least. And as I looked around at the faces of the survivors, their eyes haunted but their spirits unbroken, I knew that we would face whatever challenges lay ahead with the same courage and determination that had brought us this far. Because in the end, that was all we could do. Keep fighting. Keep surviving. Keep hoping for a better tomorrow. Even in a world where the dead walked and the living were few and far between, we had to hold on to that hope. That belief that, somewhere out there, a new life was waiting for us. The morning air was thick with the stench of decay as my scavenging team and I made our way through the deserted streets. The once vibrant city had long since fallen silent, its buildings now mere shells of their former selves, windows shattered and walls crumbling. As we picked our way through the rubble, we remained vigilant, weapons at the ready. We had learned the hard way that danger lurked around every corner, and the undead were not the only threat in this new world. Suddenly, a faint noise caught my attention. I signaled for the others to stop, my heart pounding in my chest. This sound was different from the usual groans of the undead or the skittering of rats in the shadows. It sounded almost like a whimper. Cautiously, I followed the sound, my team close behind. As we turned a corner, we froze in our tracks, eyes widening at the sight before us. There, huddled in the doorway of an abandoned store, was a small child. His clothes were tattered and filthy, his face streaked with tears and grime. He looked up at us with wide, fearful eyes, his tiny body trembling. For a moment, none of us moved. We had all seen the horrors of this new world, had all lost loved ones to the undead. But the sight of this child, alone and scared, struck a chord deep within us. I was the first to step forward, my voice soft and reassuring. "Hey there," I said, kneeling down to the child's level. "It's okay. We're not going to hurt you." The child hesitated for a moment, then launched himself into my arms, his tiny body shaking with sobs. I held him close, my heart breaking at the thought of what this child must have endured. As the team looked on, their faces somber, I knew we had a difficult decision to make. Taking the child back to the sanctuary would mean another mouth to feed, another life to protect. We searched the area for any sign of the child's family or other survivors, but found only the remnants of a once thriving community. Cars sat abandoned on the streets, doors hanging open and windows smashed. Storefronts gaped empty, their shelves bare, and floors strewn with debris. And everywhere, there were bodies. Some were the victims of the undead, their flesh torn and bones gnawed clean. Others had met a more violent end, their bodies riddled with bullets or crushed beneath fallen rubble. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in this new world. As we made our way back to the sanctuary, the child clinging tightly to my hand, the team couldn't help but feel a sense of despair. The child looked up at me, his eyes wide with wonder. For a moment, the horrors of the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by a glimmer of something brighter. In the days that followed, the child slowly began to open up to the other survivors. They were hesitant at first, their eyes haunted by the ghosts of their past. But with each passing day, they began to find a new sense of purpose in caring for this small, vulnerable life. As the sun dipped below the horizon and we gathered around the flickering campfire, I pulled out a tattered book from my backpack. The cover was faded and worn, but the title could still be made out. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Lila looked up at me, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. I smiled, my fingers tracing the spine of the book. "In the library, buried under a pile of rubble. It's a miracle it survived at all." The other survivors leaned in closer, their faces eager with anticipation. It had been so long since any of us had heard a story that didn't involve death and despair. I cleared my throat and began to read, my voice low and steady. Tom Sawyer was a mischievous boy with a heart of gold. He lived in a small town on the banks of the Mississippi River, where he spent his days fishing, swimming, and getting into all sorts of trouble. As I read, the others found themselves transported to a different world, one of lazy summer days and childhood adventures. They laughed as Tom tricked his friends into whitewashing a fence for him and held their breath as he and Huck Finn explored a dark cave in search of buried treasure. I paused, looking up from the book with a wistful smile. "I used to read this story to my little brother," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "He loved the part where Tom and Becky got lost in the cave. He would always beg me to read it again and again." Lila reached out and squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with understanding. We'd all lost so much, but in moments like these, we could find solace in shared memories and simple pleasures. As the night wore on, other survivors began to share their own stories. Some told tales of their lives before the outbreak, of loved ones lost and dreams left unfulfilled. Others shared stories they had read in books or heard from their parents. Stories of hope and resilience in the face of adversity. Sarah, the doctor, told a story about a group of animals who worked together to save their forest from destruction. "They were all different," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "But they learned that their differences were what made them strong. They each had something unique to offer, and together, they were able to accomplish the impossible." The child, who had been sitting quietly in Lila's lap, spoke up then. "I like that story," he said, his voice small but filled with conviction. "It reminds me of us. We're all different, but we work together to keep each other safe." As the fire burned low and the others began to drift off to bed, Lila and I lingered by the dying embers. She rested her head on my shoulder, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "Thank you for tonight," she said, her fingers intertwining with mine. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear those stories, to be reminded of the beauty and goodness that still exists in the world. The morning dawned cold and gray, a thick fog settling over the sanctuary like a shroud. I woke with a sense of unease, my mind still haunted by the events of the previous night. Lila and I had been on guard duty when we heard the screams. We ran toward the sound, hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. When we arrived at the source, we found a scene of horror. One of the survivors, a man named Jack, lay on the ground, his body convulsing in agony. Blood poured from his eyes and nose, and his skin had turned a sickly shade of gray. The others stood around him, their faces masks of terror and confusion. Sarah, our doctor, pushed through the crowd, her face grim. She knelt beside Jack, her hands shaking as she examined him. After a few tense moments, she looked up at us, her eyes filled with dread. "It's the virus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's infected." A wave of panic swept through us. We had all seen the effects of the virus firsthand and lost loved ones to its cruel embrace. The thought of it infiltrating the sanctuary, our one safe haven in a world gone mad, was almost too much to bear. Lila and I exchanged a glance, our eyes filled with silent understanding. We knew what had to be done, but the thought of it made our stomachs churn. Sarah stood up, her face hardened with resolve. "We have to quarantine him," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We can't risk the virus spreading to the rest of the sanctuary." But not everyone agreed. Some argued we couldn't just abandon one of our own, that we had to find a way to help him. Others feared quarantine wouldn't be enough and that the only way to truly protect the sanctuary was to take more drastic measures. As the debate raged on, Lila and I found ourselves on opposite sides. I argued for quarantine, believing it was the only way to keep the virus contained without resorting to violence. But Lila, weighed down by past losses, believed we had to do whatever it took to protect the sanctuary, even if it meant making impossible choices. The tension between us grew, our words sharp and biting as we argued back and forth. Around us, the other survivors watched in silent horror, their faces etched with the same fear and uncertainty that gripped us all. In the end, it was Sarah who made the decision. With a heavy heart, she ordered that Jack be quarantined in a remote part of the sanctuary, far from the others. She would do everything in her power to help him, but she couldn't risk the safety of the entire community. As we led Jack away, his body racked with convulsions and his eyes filled with terror, I couldn't shake the feeling we were making a terrible mistake. I knew the virus was a death sentence, that no cure or treatment could save him. But the thought of abandoning one of our own, of leaving him to suffer alone in his final moments, made my heart ache with grief and guilt. In the days that followed, the sanctuary became a place of quiet desperation. We went about our duties with grim determination, our eyes haunted by the knowledge of what lay ahead. Lila barely spoke to me, her anger and pain still raw. She spent long hours by Jack's bedside, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort, even as his body betrayed him. And then, on the 5th day, it happened. Jack's screams echoed through the sanctuary, a sound of pure agony and despair. And then, just as suddenly, they fell silent. When Lila emerged from the quarantine room, her face was ashen and her eyes hollow with grief. She looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's gone," she said, her words heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. He turned. We gathered in the courtyard, our faces somber as we grappled with the implications of Jack's death. We'd known this day would come, but the reality of it was still a blow to our fragile sense of hope and unity. As the sun set over the sanctuary, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Lila and I sat side by side, our hands clasped tightly together. We had both made choices that day that would haunt us for the rest of our lives, but we knew we'd done what we had to do to protect the people we loved. And so, As the night closed in around us, and the groans of the undead echoed in the distance, we clung to each other, our hearts heavy with the price of survival in a world gone mad. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jack's face. His eyes filled with terror and despair as the virus consumed him from within. I lay in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of all that we had lost, and all that we still had to lose. Around me, the sanctuary was quiet, the only sound the soft breathing of the other survivors as they slept. But even in the stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that some unseen danger lurked just beyond the edge of my perception. I got up, my body aching with exhaustion, and made my way outside. The night air was cool and damp, the moon hidden behind a veil of clouds. I walked the perimeter of the sanctuary, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then I heard it. A whisper, so faint that I almost missed it. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper came again, louder this time, a voice that seemed to echo from the very walls of the sanctuary itself. "You can't save them," the voice said, its tone mocking and cruel. "You can't save any of them." I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there, just the empty courtyard and the silent buildings beyond. In the days that followed, the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself that they were just a product of my own paranoia and grief. But the more I tried to push them away, the more they seemed to take hold, burrowing deep into my mind like a poison. I wasn't the only one who heard them. Others began to whisper of strange noises in the night, of shadows that moved with a will of their own. Some even claimed to have seen ghostly figures lurking in the darkness, their faces twisted with hunger and rage. At first, we tried to rationalize it away. We were all under a tremendous amount of stress, we told ourselves. It was only natural that our minds would play tricks on us, that we would see danger lurking in every shadow. But as the days turned into weeks and the whispers grew ever louder, we couldn't deny the truth any longer. Something was happening to the sanctuary, something that defied all explanation or reason. I threw myself into my work, desperate to find some way to protect the people I loved. I fortified the walls, set up new watch rotations, and scoured every inch of the sanctuary for any sign of weakness or vulnerability. But even as I worked myself to the bone, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all for nothing, that some unseen force was working against us, trying to unravel the fragile bonds that held us together. Lila saw it too. She came to me one night, her face pale and her eyes haunted with a fear I had never seen before. "I heard them again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're getting stronger, Hunter. I can feel them, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike." I held her close, my own fear mingling with hers until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. We clung to each other in the darkness, our bodies shaking with the weight of all that we had endured and all that we still had to face. And then, one night, everything changed. I was on watch duty, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the walls. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the light, its form twisted and grotesque. I raised my weapon, my finger hovering over the trigger. But as I stared into the figure's eyes, I felt a chill run down my spine. Because in that moment, I realized the truth. The figure was me. Or rather, it was a version of me. A reflection of all the fear and despair and guilt that I had been carrying with me since the world had ended. And in that moment, I understood. The whispers, the shadows, the ghostly figures in the night, they weren't some external threat. but a manifestation of our own trauma and grief. We had been through so much, had lost so many, that our minds had begun to fracture under the strain. I lowered my weapon, my heart heavy with the weight of this revelation. I knew that I couldn't fight this battle alone, that none of us could. We had to come together, to confront the darkness within ourselves before it consumed us all. The morning sun cast a pale light over the sanctuary as I gathered with the other survivors in the courtyard. The events of the previous weeks weighed heavily on our minds, and the need for better fortifications had become increasingly clear. "We can't keep going on like this," Marcus said, his voice grave. "We need to make the sanctuary stronger, more secure. We need to build something that will last." There were murmurs of agreement from the gathered survivors. We had all seen the horrors that lurked beyond the walls, and we knew that our current defenses wouldn't hold forever. "I agree," I said, stepping forward. "But we can't do it without supplies. We need metal, concrete, tools. We need to scavenge everything we can find." Lila nodded, her eyes determined. "Hunter's right. We need to send out a team to gather resources, but we need to be smart about it. We can't afford to lose anyone else." We spent the next hour discussing the details of the plan. We would send out a small team, no more than 4 people, to search the surrounding area for construction supplies. We would focus on abandoned warehouses and construction sites, anywhere that might have the materials we needed. I volunteered to lead the team, along with Lila, Marcus, and a survivor named Alex. Alex was a former construction worker, and his knowledge of building materials and techniques would be invaluable. We gathered our gear and set out, the weight of our mission heavy on our shoulders. We knew that every moment we spent outside the walls was a risk, but we also knew that the fate of the sanctuary depended on our success. Our first stop was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was massive, its walls rusted and its windows shattered. But as we picked our way through the debris, we found what we were looking for: stacks of metal sheets, coils of wire, and cans of welding fuel. We loaded up the supplies onto a flatbed truck we had found nearby, strapping them down with ropes and bungee cords. It was slow work, but we knew that every piece we brought back would be one step closer to a stronger, safer sanctuary. As we worked, we kept a watchful eye on our surroundings. The area was quiet, but we knew that the zombies could appear at any moment. We had all seen firsthand how quickly a situation could turn deadly. We moved on to a nearby construction site, picking through the rubble for anything useful. We found bags of concrete mix, rolls of rebar, and even a few power tools that had been left behind in the chaos of the outbreak. But as we loaded up the last of the supplies, we heard a sound that made our blood run cold. The distant groans of a zombie horde, growing louder with every passing second. "We need to move," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "Now!" We scrambled back to the truck, our hearts pounding in our chests. We could hear the zombies getting closer, their shuffling steps and hungry moans echoing off the buildings. I jumped behind the wheel, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out of the construction site just as the first zombies rounded the corner. We drove back to the sanctuary in tense silence, our minds reeling with the close call. But as we pulled through the gates and saw the other survivors waiting for us, their faces filled with hope and relief, we knew that it had all been worth it. Over the next few days, we inventoried our new supplies and began to make plans for the upgrades. We would start with the walls, reinforcing them with metal plates and support beams. We would dig trenches and pits around the perimeter, creating a second line of defense against the hordes. And we would build watchtowers at key points, giving us a better vantage point to spot potential threats. It was a daunting task, but we knew that it was necessary. The sanctuary was our home, our safe haven in a world gone mad. And we would do whatever it took to protect it, and the people who called it home. The sun was setting over the sanctuary as we gathered around the central fire pit. The mood was somber, but there was an undercurrent of determination that ran through the group. We had the supplies we needed to fortify our home, and now it was time to put our plans into action. I stood up, my gaze sweeping over the assembled survivors. "We've all seen what's out there," I said, my voice steady. We know the dangers that we face, but we also know that we have the power to protect ourselves, to build something that will keep us safe. There were nods of agreement from the others, their faces flickering in the firelight. Lila stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Hunter and I have been working on a plan, she said, her voice clear and strong. A way to make the sanctuary a true fortress, a place where we can live without fear. She unrolled a large piece of paper, spreading it out on the ground in front of us. It was a map of the sanctuary and the surrounding area, marked with notes and sketches in Lila's neat handwriting. We start with the walls, she said, pointing to the perimeter of the sanctuary. We reinforce them with the metal sheets and support beams that we scavenged. We weld them together, create a barrier that nothing can break through. There were murmurs of approval from the others, and I felt a surge of pride in Lila's dedication and skill. She had worked tirelessly on this plan, poring over every detail until it was perfect. But the walls are just the beginning, I said, taking over. We need to create a second line of defense, something that will slow down the hordes and give us time to prepare. I pointed to the areas around the sanctuary, marking them with a red pen. We dig trenches here, here, and here, deep enough to trap the zombies, with sharpened stakes at the bottom to finish them off. We line the edges with barbed wire, make it impossible for them to climb out. There were nods of approval from the others, and I could see the gears turning in their minds as they envisioned the finished product. And what about the blind spots? Alex asked, his brow furrowed. We can't see everything from the ground, Lila smiled, pointing to the corners of the sanctuary. That's where the watchtowers come in. We build them tall and sturdy, with clear lines of sight in every direction. We man them 24/7, always on the lookout for danger. The plan was ambitious, but we all knew that it was necessary. We spent the next few hours going over every detail, assigning tasks and responsibilities to each member of the group. Some would work on welding the metal sheets together, while others would begin digging the trenches and laying the barbed wire. Alex and a few others with construction experience would oversee the building of the watchtowers, making sure they were strong enough to withstand anything. As the night wore on and the firelight began to die down, I felt a sense of hope and purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. We had a plan, a way forward, and we were all in it together. The morning air was crisp and cool as we gathered at the base of the sanctuary's walls. The metal sheets and support beams we had scavenged were stacked nearby, gleaming in the early light. We had a long day ahead of us, but we were ready to face it head-on. I stood before the group, my welding mask pushed up on my forehead. "All right, everyone," I said, my voice carrying across the courtyard. "We all know what we need to do. Let's get to work." We divided into teams, each with a specific task. Some would be measuring and cutting the metal sheets to size, while others would be welding them onto the existing walls. Alex and his team would be working on creating the support structure, ensuring that the walls would be strong enough to withstand anything. I grabbed my welding gear and headed over to the first section of the wall. The metal was cold beneath my fingers as I measured out the placement of the sheets, marking the spots where they would need to be welded. Beside me, Lila was already at work, her welding torch sparking to life as she began to fuse the metal together. She moved with precision and skill, her hands steady as she guided the torch along the seams. I pulled down my mask and lit my own torch, feeling the familiar rush of heat against my face. The work was hard and grueling, but there was something satisfying about it, something that made me feel like I was making a real difference. As the day wore on, we fell into a rhythm. The sound of metal on metal filled the air, punctuated by the hiss and crackle of the welding torches. We worked in shifts, taking turns to rest and hydrate in the shade of the nearby buildings. But even as we made progress, we began to run into challenges. Some of the metal sheets were warped or bent, making them difficult to fit together seamlessly. We had to improvise, cutting and shaping the pieces until they fit like puzzle pieces. At one point, we ran out of the welding rods we needed to fuse the metal together. I cursed under my breath, knowing that we couldn't afford to lose momentum. But before I could even suggest a solution, Marcus appeared at my side, a box of rods in his hands. "I found these in the back of the supply room," he said, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "I figured we might need them." I clapped him on the shoulder, feeling a rush of gratitude for his foresight. "Good thinking," I said, grabbing a handful of rods. "Let's keep moving." As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, we stepped back to admire our work. The walls of the sanctuary were now reinforced with thick sheets of metal, welded together in a seamless barrier. The support structure was strong and sturdy, anchored deep into the ground. It was an impressive sight, a testament to the skill and dedication of our community. But even as we celebrated our accomplishment, we knew that there was still more work to be done. The trenches and pits still needed to be dug, and the watchtowers had to be built. We would need to work quickly and efficiently, always mindful of the dangers that lurked beyond the walls. But for now, we allowed ourselves a moment of rest and reflection. We had taken the first step towards making the sanctuary a true fortress. A place where we could live and thrive in safety. As I looked around at the faces of the other survivors, I saw a new sense of purpose and determination in their eyes. We had all been through so much, had all seen the worst that the world had to offer. But we had also found something worth fighting for, something that gave our lives meaning in the midst of the chaos. We were a community, a family bound together by our common struggle for survival. And as long as we had each other, I knew that we could face anything that came our way. The road ahead would be long and hard, filled with challenges and setbacks that we could only imagine. But we would face them together, united in our resolve to build a better future for ourselves and for the generations to come. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as we gathered at the edge of the sanctuary, our tools and equipment at the ready. The air was cool and damp, and a thin mist clung to the ground, obscuring the ruined city beyond. I stood before the group, my shovel resting on my shoulder. "All right, everyone," I said, my breath misting in the chill air. "We've got a lot of ground to cover today. Let's get started." We had spent the past few days gathering the equipment we would need for the trenches, shovels, pickaxes, and even a few jackhammers that we had scavenged from a nearby construction site. It wasn't the most advanced equipment, but it would get the job done. We divided into teams, each responsible for a different section of the perimeter. I led my team towards the north side of the sanctuary, where the ground was hard and rocky. As we walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. We were venturing outside the walls, into the very heart of the danger that lurked beyond. But I knew that this work was necessary, that it would help keep us safe in the long run. We reached our designated spot and set to work, breaking ground with our shovels and pickaxes. The soil was dense and stubborn, and every strike sent shockwaves up my arms. Beside me, Alex was working with one of the jackhammers, the machine's percussive rhythm filling the air. He moved with practiced precision, his hands steady as he guided the tool through the rocky terrain. As the day wore on, we fell into a rhythm. The sound of metal on stone filled the air, punctuated by the occasional grunt of exertion. But even as we made progress, we had to remain vigilant. The noise of the jackhammers and the sound of our tools could attract the attention of any zombies in the area. We posted lookouts on the surrounding rooftops, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. At one point, a shout rang out from above. "Zombies! To the east!" one of the lookouts cried, his voice urgent. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I grabbed my weapon, my eyes scanning the streets. In the distance, I could see a group of zombies shambling towards us, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Everyone, fall back to the sanctuary!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the din of the equipment. "We'll hold them off from there." We moved quickly, abandoning our tools and equipment as we raced back towards the safety of the walls. I could hear the zombies behind us, their growls and moans growing louder with every passing second. We made it back just in time, the gates slamming shut behind us as the zombies slammed against the metal. We watched as they clawed and scratched at the walls, their eyes hungry and vacant. But the walls held strong, the metal and concrete unyielding against the onslaught. We had built them to last, and they would not fail us now. As the zombies dispersed back into the city, we regrouped and assessed the situation. We had lost some of our equipment in the retreat, but we had all made it back safely. We knew that we couldn't let this setback stop us. The trenches were too important, too vital to our survival. We would have to find a way to keep going, to keep digging no matter the cost. Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly, braving the dangers of the city to continue our work. We dug through the day and into the night, our hands blistered and our muscles aching with fatigue. But slowly, inch by inch, the trenches began to take shape. They were deep and wide, lined with sharpened stakes and barbed wire. They would be a formidable obstacle for any zombie horde, a last line of defense against the monsters that roamed the city. As I stood at the edge of the completed trench, looking out over the ruined landscape beyond, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. We had done it, against all odds. We had taken another step towards making the sanctuary a true fortress, a place where we could live and thrive in safety. But even as we celebrated our victory, I knew that there was still more work to be done. The watchtowers still needed to be built, and there were always more supplies to be scavenged, more defenses to be reinforced. But for now, we allowed ourselves a moment of rest and reflection. We had proven that we could face any challenge, overcome any obstacle. The sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon as we gathered at the base of the newly constructed watchtower. It was an impressive sight, rising tall and sturdy above the walls of the sanctuary. The metal gleamed in the early morning light, a testament to the hard work and dedication of our community. I stood before the group, my hands resting on my hips as I surveyed the structure. "All right, everyone," I said, my voice carrying across the courtyard. "We've got one last piece of the puzzle to put in place. Let's get to work." Over the past few weeks, we had been working tirelessly to construct the watchtowers that would serve as our eyes and ears on the horizon. We had scavenged metal and wood from abandoned buildings and construction sites, hauling it back to the sanctuary in trucks and on makeshift carts. It had been a daunting task, but we had tackled it with the same determination and grit that had gotten us this far. We had worked in shifts, some of us welding the metal frames together while others hauled the heavy wooden planks up the scaffolding. Now, as I stood at the base of the finished tower, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. We had done it, against all odds. We had built something that would help keep us safe. Something that would give us a fighting chance against the horrors that lurked beyond the walls. I climbed the ladder to the top of the tower, my boots clanging against the metal rungs. As I emerged onto the platform, I was struck by the view that stretched out before me. From this vantage point, I could see for miles in every direction. The ruined city stretched out like a maze of broken buildings and overgrown streets, the occasional movement of a zombie catching my eye in the distance. But beyond the city, I could see the rolling hills and dense forests that surrounded us. It was a reminder that there was still beauty in this world, still places untouched by the ravages of the outbreak. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Lila emerging onto the platform. She had a rifle slung over her shoulder and a determined look on her face. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said, coming to stand beside me at the railing. "I never thought I'd see something like this again." I nodded, my eyes scanning the horizon. "It's a start," I said, my voice quiet. "But there's still a lot of work to be done." We spent the next few hours getting the watchtower fully operational. We installed solar panels and batteries to power the spotlights and radio equipment, ensuring that we would have a reliable means of communication with the ground. We also established a rotation of guards, each of us taking shifts to keep watch over the surrounding area. It was a big responsibility, but one that we all took seriously. We knew that the safety of the sanctuary depended on our vigilance and quick thinking. I found myself standing at the top of the watchtower once again. The city was bathed in a warm, golden light, the shadows lengthening across the broken streets. I heard a crackle of static from the radio and picked up the receiver. "Hunter, this is Marcus," came the voice on the other end. "We've got a situation at the front gate. Can you come down?" As I emerged into the courtyard and approached the front gate, I saw Marcus and a small group of survivors gathered around a stranger. The newcomer looked exhausted and worn, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes as they took in the sight of our community. "They've been on the road for weeks," Marcus explained, his voice filled with compassion. "They're looking for a place to call home." I stepped forward and extended my hand to the stranger. "Welcome to the sanctuary."